let's jump into Berkshire Hathaway because over the weekend, we saw the company release second quarter earnings. And, Berkshire, the nice thing about their earnings release is not a lot of that pomp and circumstance. I mean, it's a 10Q. You don't get an 8K. You don't get a transcript. You don't get an earnings call. It's just, here's what it is in fine filing fashion, and keep on moving forward. So you got to go in there and do a little bit of the work when it comes to digging into these Berkshire Hathaway earnings. But it seems like, at least on the surface, the business is recovering nicely from what was a difficult 2020.
Yeah, you're right. Warren Buffett and his team pretty much just put the release out there and say, all right, see you at the annual meeting next year. And they're one of the rare companies that reports their earnings on Saturdays. Every earnings report of theirs comes out on a Saturday morning.
Yeah,
and they do that by design. It's so their earnings that investors have a chance to digest the information, outside of market hours.
Yep.
I mean, you always hear about these stocks like spiking 20% on earnings day and then ending lower, or having to be halted a few times because of they're so volatile on earnings day. That's not an issue with Berkshire because they're a big company and don't tend to have volatile moves. And two, they intentionally give people time to digest earnings. What a concept.
Yeah, novel indeed.
But on the headline numbers, earnings were up about 7% year over year. But Warren Buffett himself tells investors not to pay attention to the earnings per share number. And the reason is, we all know Berkshire's most of its value, the bulk of its value, is in the stock portfolio.
Yeah.
Berkshire stock portfolio is worth over $300 billion. So it's about half the company right now. And those earnings results reflect the unrealized gains and losses from the stock portfolio. For example, if Berkshire's Apple investment went up $10 billion over the past year, that's reflected on a per share basis in its earnings, even though it hasn't really made that money yet until Berkshire hits the sell button someday. So it's not really an accurate reflection of how much the company's actually making. So for that, we need to kind of get past the headline number and get into Berkshire's operating businesses. And on the operating earnings, you mentioned they recovered nicely from COVID, and you can certainly see it in this number. Operating earnings, meaning that its businesses owned, were up 21% year over year.
Nice.
Those are businesses like Geico, Duracell, Berkshire's utilities businesses, all the consumer products businesses they own, Clayton Homes,
the railroads, right?
The railroads,
Yeah.
The railroads did really well. The railroad utility and energy segment were the best performing part. They were up. The earnings from that segment were up 27% year over year.
Yeah.
Which is pretty impressive. I mean, during the COVID lockdowns, they didn't have the need to transport as much around the country.
Yep.
I mean, utilities and energy perform well no matter what. People still paid their electric bills during the pandemic for the most part.
Oh yeah, got to keep the power on, and now more than ever, right? Everybody needs more power and more connectivity than ever before.
Right, and I mean, Geico did just fine during the pandemic because even though people weren't driving, and they gave people somewhat of a, I think they were one of the ones that gave a discount because people weren't driving during the pandemic.
They did. We got the same thing. We've been with Progressive for 15, 20 years now or something like that. And Progressive did the same thing. We got a little bit of a rebate, which was nice, I mean,
yeah, but at the same time, people weren't driving, so there were fewer claims Berkshire had to pay out.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point.
So they passed some of that on to their customers, which is nice. So the insurance premiums Berkshire collected were up 10% year over year, which is to be expected. That's a slower growth because that was a very resilient business during the pandemic. So there's that. And got to remember, this whole quarter is being compared to the second quarter of 2020, which is a terrible comparison for any company.
Yep.
I mean, Berkshire has over 60 businesses that it owns in addition to its stock portfolio. So pretty much all of its businesses were affected to one extent or another. Some were absolutely devastated by the pandemic.